Oh, isn't it sensational too when you wake up on a Monday morning and find that the Money of Mine video has been put on the Silver Lake Resources website, the link, and there is today now a new announcement from them. And let's note another non-ASX announcement, which is a clarification from Silver Lake in a lot of detail about this whole competing proposal for the Leonora assets. Lads, excitement levels rated 1 to 10. How are we?
Oh mate, I'm captivated. I mean, we're filming pretty late today, and I feel like we're getting very in the weeds on this deal in a way that we normally don't. We're a bit more surface level, but I feel like we're into this one. It's like riveting.
Yeah, I'll give you an 8 out of 10, Maddie. I think this is a really exciting announcement, and I think what I can sort of surmise from the transaction and the announcement, and we'll go into it in much greater detail, is that this is a push to reach out to the St. Barbara shareholders. What do you guys reckon?
Mate, absolutely. This announcement is 100% a sales pitch to St. Barbara's existing shareholders. It's pitching the merits of themselves as a company, and also the merit of the premium that they're offering. A
lot of aggressive wording, and I don't know if there's a few slide digs that you can read into, whether you read into, maybe I've read into them too much, but a lot of things stood out, and we're going to go through the whole thing and give a bit more of analysis. And if you didn't hear our first episode on this deal, head back to last week. There's the YouTube video, the full audio episode on Silver Lake's first deal they put to St. Barbara, which didn't make the ASX. Now, this
probably wasn't the first deal. I mean, we found out today that they've been talking for 12 months.
This is true.
It's the first one we've seen publicly.
And then, because I did raise the question last week, why have Silver Lake waited this long to put a proposal in to buy the Leonora assets? But at the second paragraph of this announcement, it states that Silver Lake has unsuccessfully attempted to engage with St. Barbara over the last 12 months. So why?
Yeah, so a lot of stern words in there, like you highlighted, Maddie, and I think they've got a bit of a bone to pick with a couple different entities. I'm sure one of them is with the ASX, the St. Barbara board, and perhaps from some of the wording, Genesis as well, wouldn't you think?
Yeah, well, and as we are pretty much taking on the role of the ASX for Silver Lake at the moment, because as I said, this has not been released to the ASX. So if you want a copy of the full announcement, head to the Silver Lake Resources website, go to Investors, Media Announcements, and you will find this announcement, also with a link to our previous episode. So let's get into it, lads. Let's run through it. As we previously mentioned, Silver Lake were attempting to engage, but unsuccessfully, with the St. Barbara board for the past 12 months. You would assume in relation to possibly acquiring this. Silver Lake is, as they say in this announcement, extremely disappointed that the St. Barbara board has determined not to engage with them. Right, let's get into it. Where would we like to start? There's a bit to go through here.
How about we start with the one of their first rebuttals regarding the 2 weeks due diligence. So one of St. Barbara's points was that they didn't believe that Silver Lake would be able to get through and do the due diligence, and on the reverse side, that St. Barbara wouldn't be able to do the due diligence of Silver Lake, bearing in mind that they would be a roughly 26% shareholder in Silver Lake post the transaction. So they didn't think that was a quick enough time. So one of the rebuttals straight up was that, had they just sort of said yes, they could be halfway done with that now. And I think it's a pretty valid point. St. Barbara don't need to accept the deal to let that due diligence start. So they could have got that underway, and it seems like there's only upside from that point of view. They could have had Silver Lake come in, potentially turn that into a binding agreement or a binding bid, and that would lead to what we discussed on Friday, the matching component of Genesis's deal to get the Leonora assets.
Yeah, I think
and
on
the
that,
fact that it's been going for 12 months, Trav, do you think they would have done a lot of DD already?
Yeah, it sounds like the response that they've had while they've been knocking on the door has not been, an inviting one. So I'm sure they've done as much DD as they can from public information. I'm sure they still have some questions that relate to the sort of information that you keep behind closed doors. But JD, to your point on the strategy of letting them in the front door or not, the piece of information that we don't have in front of us, and we won't until the transaction docs come up on the ASX, is what exactly are the terms, the fiduciary terms, and the customary fiduciary out in relation to the exclusivity of the no shop, no talk, etc. Silver Lake have made some estimations of what those terms are in this letter, but the extent to which we have real visibility on what the fiduciary out looks like is really subject to the terms of those clauses.
Yeah, they've kept it quite close to their chest, haven't they, St. Barbara? So it also brings about a couple other questions as to why St. Barbara don't just open the door and let Silver Lake do a bit of due diligence and see if the value sort of stacks up. And I think this goes back to what we spoke about on Friday that relates to deal fatigue, the personal relationships that was highlighted in the LinkedIn post, which of course Silver Lake highlighted later on, and a bit of commitment bias to this transaction that's been in the works for quite a while.
Yeah, they had a big dig at that at Dan Locker's post about with the keys to go in parallel with Ral Finlanson's photo of him at Gwalia. He said, I can't let Ral have the only social media post. So picture of the keys saying there was looking forward to the deal to be done by July 1st. But then Silver Lake have put it in their announcement today saying, look, the fact that St. Barbara shareholders hadn't approved the deal yet, it appears presumptuous and inappropriate to be making such public statements. So
yeah, it's an interesting one now with the knowledge that we have that Silver Lake had been trying to knock on the door for 12 months that he would make this LinkedIn post. But I think, how about we start going through a few more of the lines of the Silver Lake rebuttal to each of those points that St. Barbara made.
Mate, it looks like they've downloaded the transcript from Friday's Money of Mine episode and just put a Silver Lake letterhead on it. What do you guys reckon?
Doesn't it, hey?
Oh, Jesus Christ. It's been good getting a lot of positive feedback for this one, in contrast to our previous negative feedback from Patriot and AVZ shareholders.
Yeah, almost feel the need to flag that we're just sort of calling it how it is, aren't we?
That's right, mate. Despite
obviously, you boys have called it very well. There's been a lot of great feedback from the episode, FYI.
Yeah, so let's dig into it a bit. So straight up the top, talking about that contingent payment. Silver Lake obviously had a bit of a gripe with this as well, and I think that's something we'd rightly highlighted on Friday. You can't really count that $60 million as $60 million at face value, given it's years down the track, and there's potential doubts as to whether that'll come about. Hey,
well, yeah. Silver Lake's wording was as receipt of the consideration by St. Barbara remains uncertain. So
I did note that Silver Lake were apprehensive to actually value that themselves. They did some analysis, wording it as consider it as full tote, and then they did some analysis excluding it. But they were interestingly a bit apprehensive to try and value that themselves.
Yeah, that's right. In the charts, the one chart I think that they include in the announcement today, you can see it doesn't count any of that at all when they look back at what that premium percentage for the Genesis bid looks like.
I still think a 20% haircut to that is probably fair. JD, what about the point on funding essentially being ready?
Yep, I think we called this one as well. I don't think the point that St. Barbara made holds much water. I'm certain that Silver Lake would have spoken with Taurus. They would have had the $150 million facility lined up. Taurus in turn would have been ready and agreed to do their due diligence in 2 weeks. And on top of that, Silver Lake themselves have, I think, $268 million in cash, so that one doesn't hold much water for me.
Yeah, could have been confirmed at the Macquarie Investor conference last week, which Silver Lake were at, and I assume Taurus might have been as well.
Well, Silver Lake revealed that that facility was already credit approved. It was just the subject to the due diligence that they would have undertaken, and in all fairness, the big factor for Taurus wouldn't have actually been the outcomes of that due diligence. It'd likely just been whatever security was offered by Silver Lake, because the value of Silver Lake's assets is just miles greater than the value of any acquisition facility that would have been provided. So there's so much protection there as a lender that you're just not worried.
Yeah, there was one other point that we didn't talk too much about, a potential $25 million working capital facility Silver Lake would offer to St. Barbara to sort of see them through that time, and that sort of speaks to the cash flow issues that we have. So that leads in turn to the next point. Silver Lake state that St. Barbara would have $148 million in cash. Now, our analysis showed a number quite a bit smaller, but Trevor, I'll let you break down where the differences really lie. And just to state up the top, I think when you look at it from our point of view, even though the number at face value is very different, I think our analysis still holds up quite well, doesn't it?
I think so. So yeah, I mean, Silver Lake argue that St. Barbara's pro forma cash under the Silver Lake offer would be $148 million. On Friday's episode, we articulated why we thought that number is actually more like $41 million. So I think it is worth touching on. You might be thinking, oh, geez, what did you guys get wrong? But I think there's a few different perspectives to add here. The first thing to point out is that Silver Lake are articulating what St. Barbara's unrestricted pro forma cash balance would be. But you have to keep in mind that St. Barbara have already flagged that they're going to be required to have a restricted cash amount equivalent to about 75 million Aussie bucks in order to back an environmental liability in relation to their Atlantic asset. And so when you look at what St. Barbara's going to actually be able to do from the perspective of funding, development at their Atlantic and Simberi assets after the fact, they can't use that cash. So I think it's far more interesting to talk about, what is the cash amount that they're going to have that they can actually use to create value in these assets, and you have to net that off. Exactly.
We're really highlighting the unrestricted cash amount that St. Barbara will have after the fact that they can put into their subsequent two assets that they hold to get them up to scratch, really, aren't we?
Totally. And look, I think there's another calculation difference that drives things a little bit here, and that's I actually think Silver Lake may have missed this very minor detail, or maybe they've intentionally left it out. I'm not so sure.
Although St. Barbara did work hard to make it hard to come by.
Yeah, I mean it could entirely have been missed because it's a very little footnote on one of St. Barbara's presentations, and it's a footnote that happens to change between presentations that are only 10 days apart. And that's that, St. Barbara disclosed that while they have $60 million cash as at the 31st of March, there's actually $20 million penned to go out the door for stamp duty for the Bardock acquisition and some other costs. And so when you look at St. Barbara's sources and uses of cash in the Genesis offer, in the very first presentation that went out for that deal, they basically report their cash balance as at the 31 of March at $40 million, and there's no footnote on it that says that's the 60 minus the 20. And very intriguingly, when they report their quarterly presentation just 10 days after it, there's that $40 million, and it no longer says as at 31 March. It's footnoted as saying 60 less the 20. And why does this matter? Because I think Silver Lake have just used St. Barbara's cash balance, saying that it is $60 million, which as at 31 of March is correct, but they're not subtracting the $20 million that is required to be spent on this Bardock stamp duty and some other costs that clearly are actually part of the internal liabilities for St. Barbara.
Yeah, so I think that just really hammers home our point that the roughly 40 million that we flagged will be the cash that St. Barbara have available to spend on their assets.
Totally. And I think we had about a $10 million discrepancy on how we estimate tax, and we stand by our statement that there's 40 to 50 million bucks of cash is going to be available to St. Barbara at the end of the Silver Lake transaction if it was pursued.
And that's plus 26% shareholding in Silver Lake.
Yeah, you're right. The shareholding, like the shares
which they can sell.
Exactly, and Silver Lake make a point of articulating that their shares that they're given are additional funding lever for St. Barbara if they had some sort of funding gap from what their future plans are. I think it's an important point to talk about because, it's a genuinely valid perspective of the board to think we need a certain amount of cash in order to create value in these assets. Now, they've really stood back from actually talking any number about what is required to spend on these assets, right? And they've kind of maybe even backed themselves into a corner of having to stick to that that line because all of the messaging has been we'll talk about that after the deal with Genesis.
Exactly. They've really highlighted that Simberi and Atlantic, the figures related to the capex to get those things humming again, that's only going to be spoken about second half of this year once the transaction's done and dusted.
Completely. But, maybe they have some view or some sort of, like thumbs up number that they have in mind that is actually going to be required there. But it's, and if they do have some indication of what that is, then it would be sort of a valid perspective to think that the Genesis offer may be superior because you're going to result in less dilution in the long run because they'd have to raise more money in order to create the value via the capex. And so you could do some per share analysis and actually get a better outcome potentially. But the valid point that Silver Lake make though is that their shares can actually be used as a funding lever to get the cash to do that. I think we would all benefit from knowing a little bit more guidance about how much money is needed to be spent on Atlantic and Simberi, and then we can, as commentators and analysts and shareholders for some investors out there, make better decisions about this too.
Yeah, and I think there's one other thing that would be right to say that Silver Lake stated, alluding to that fact that you just mentioned, Trav. St. Barbara state in one of their previous presentations that they are planning on distributing all, if not all, almost all of the shares that they get and the cash from the Genesis transaction to their shareholders. So what Silver Lake sort of say in turn is that yes, this could be used as a lever, as cash, and that St. Barbara don't have to go and give all that cash out to their shareholders. They can keep a bit more on hand, sell the shares, and have the cash.
What do you think about the 26% shareholding that St. Barbara's would have in Silver Lake compared to the 15.5 they would add in Genesis up to I think it was 19.7 post-contingent? The fact that, as Trav, you outlined in last week's episode, that going over that 20% threshold would mean that, and the Silver Lake have stated in this announcement, that an independent expert's report would be required to approve it, and that means, they have to independently review Silver Lake's business for this, which, and as we discussed last week, the issue with Genesis being reviewed independently, which they weren't being done, had to do because they were below 20%, would be, Ulysses doesn't have an oil reserve. There's a management premium attached to it with RAL at the helm. Silver Lake don't appear to be bothered by that. They said they've got operating mines, generating cash flow. What's your thoughts on that, lads?
Mate, my line of thinking around this keeps coming back to the timing factor, and I can't quite debunk it yet, and I'm trying, trust me. For the St. Barbara board to be so standoffish to what we think is a superior deal, there must be some real incentive around the completion happening at this 30 June date that has been flagged in so many different avenues. And 30 June is a pretty unusual date to pick, but everyone seems to be talking about it. Of course, it's the end of a financial year for most Australian companies. And so it's just, to me, it's really like all of these different angles would like let's say you entertain the Silver Lake deal and then and Genesis ended up matching it, right? And then they match it, it just elongates things, and then you're not able to complete by 30th of June. So I think there's some real incentive from my perspective to complete this by 30th of June. And I did a little bit of digging, and I could dig up in St. Barbara's half year financial reporting that they talk about a certain review date occurring on the 30th of June 2023 in relation to some of the outstanding debt facilities from their lenders. So I'm speculating here, but they might have some degree of pressure being put on them from their lenders at the moment, and there might be something to do with that certain date that is driving a rationale to complete then.
Do you think from a lender's perspective that those concerns will be put at ease when there is a superior offer there, but?
It could 100% could be. And you know what? While we're talking about the dynamics of lenders and debt here, I also find it intriguing that Silver Lake's angle wasn't to buy the debt. We saw them do just that when they acquired Hart in Canada. Sort of gives them a front row seat to actually acquiring the assets. But
I do wonder how
but I guess they get the assets they don't want if they do that process.
Yeah, exactly. And I wonder how sort of plausible that is with the bank syndicates, given that the initial Genesis deal, which came out prior to that half yearly, what the intention was to clear the debt books for St. Barbara, wasn't it? So
right. Rebuttal points. What else was there, JD?
strategic fit, management experience. I think we highlighted this one quite well. We highlighted the fact that Silver Lake has a team that they just know the Leonora assets, don't they? So I think we can jump straight into the next one, or later on in that point, actually, talking about total shareholder return. Now, I don't totally agree with Silver Lake on this point. I'm not sure what you guys think. But
What is their point, JD?
So they have a total shareholder return figure of 197% over the past 5 years. So that, in their wording, stands them out amongst peers over that period of time. Now,
It's pretty interesting.
yeah, I think they haven't given the actual comps. We can't see what companies they use. But if you look into the finer detail a bit and you look at the timing of that 5 years, it wasn't as of the close on Friday and the 5 years preceding that. It was, I think, smartly chosen as, I think it was the end of March, 31st of March 2018 until the end of March this financial year. Now, if you nose around a bit and have a bit of a dig into that, you'll see that the early months there were really strong performing months for the stock price of Silver Lake that make the whole subsequent period look quite strong, don't they?
Totally. I mean, yeah. Look at what they were. So they've selected a period from the 29th of March 2018, and why would you choose that 5 years to the 31 of March? I mean, maybe surely, maybe someone reading it without, having worked in banking will be thinking, oh no, they've just chosen one that corresponds to the latest ending quarter. And the cynic in me knows that there's some cherry picking going on. And ultimately, what they've done is they've manipulated the data a little. They've manipulated, but they've chosen a period that paints a much more favourable picture than if you just chosen the last 5 years from at close Friday, which would have painted, I think a fairer representation. And it drives the number a lot, right? Because you're basically looking at on the 28th of March 2018, their close price was 38 cents, and then about a month later it was 60 cents. So that's about a 60% return in about a month there, which massively kind of adds a difference to the total shareholder return calc. So,
and it's kind of compounded, isn't it? So it looks quite good, and it did stand out a little bit in comparison to a lot of the other figures. We've been trying to do this in as real time as possible using share figures from live or the previous closing day. So it did stand out a little bit once you read the footnotes.
Totally, and like speaking of sort of cherry picking, I mean they're cherry picking a time frame there, and
everyone does it, don't they?
Yeah, and I think they've probably cherry picked a data set too because. I actually haven't run the comps myself, but I imagine they've probably left out Capricorn and just framed that as choosing peers that are were producing 5 years ago. They've probably left out a few others.
Yeah, I dare say it was gold miners, probably Australian domiciled with assets here in Australia that were mining 5 years ago and mining today.
I think and like JD, like if I was advising Silver Lake, I wouldn't have made this TSR point. I think they've got a strong enough case without doing this. I think this is sort of that angle of they're really trying to pitch themselves as to St. Barbara shareholders, and I think I wouldn't have made the TSR argument because it's like A, you can point the holes in the cherry picking bit, which we have, but B, what's St. Barbara going to do? They're going to point to Rally's amazing total shareholder return when he ran Saracen for his last 5 years there, and it'll blow Silver Lakes out of the park. So it's just an argument I don't think they should have made.
Agreed. So I think we can jump on to the next one, Maddie. Silver Lake keen to play down the synergies with Genesis and St. Barbara. So
yeah, I think this was one of the more aggressive parts of the announcement. And I want to go through a few bits that I thought that were aggressive through the whole thing, or maybe some little slide digs. But this was definitely one. So, as I said, this suggested operational synergies for the Genesis transaction was, their words were assumption that material from the Genesis Ulysses project will be processed through Leonora. Genesis Ulysses project does not have a declared ore reserve, and another use of assumption seems premature. So they're really honing in on the fact that, and as we stated, Genesis doesn't have an ore reserve or a mine plan, which can really open up a lot of different numbers and analysis. Look, I don't know what the Ulysses ore body looks like. There's no I couldn't really find cross sections of it, but the Gwalia dips at 40 degrees. So, and if you've got a very shallow dipping ore body, that can bring in a lot of factors of mineable stope shapes, increased dilution, recovery of ore, depending if you pull your footwall. So, look,
you told me it was 30 degrees this morning. Have you done your homework since, or is it
Well, I didn't want to claim something that I've been told at a pub, but but let's just go on the fact that Gwalia dips at 40 degrees. Yeah. So, that is. I think that is a big point.
Yeah,
that is a big point.
Yeah, to your point on strong wording, there was a quote. There's little unique synergies highlighted in the Genesis St. Barbara deal. That's something that Silver Lake said. So I think that's a bit of a punchback to a line that we saw in the St. Barbara announcement on Friday that said the Silver Lake proposal didn't have many quantifiable benefits. So there was another line in the announcement today that Silver Lake had. St. Barbara's scalable Leonora mill has significant and increased incumbency value in the prevailing climate. Now, how I read this is that Silver Lake will be looking for additional bolt-on assets, companies, projects in the area. What do you guys think?
Totally. I wouldn't be surprised if they're, in advanced discussions with other, bolt-on projects in the area. For them to have such a strong view here, they've clearly got a pretty favourable outcome on their ability to create value through regional consolidation. That's what I think.
Yeah, and we tossed around the name Red. I think we did at least on Friday. There's other companies in that.
We didn't even talk about, Kin, for example, like on Friday's episode, who wedged themselves into the Dacian deal, hoping they'd get wrapped up, and Rel said no. So I think there's a whole bunch of little, players in the region who might have some ore that could feed a mill at some stage.
100%. So I think that really wraps up the rebuttals that Silver Lake had to all of St. Barbara's points. But they have stated down the bottom that they're still open to doing the deal on an expedited basis. Now, I think that really speaks to them still willing to buy these things at speed because they know St. Barbara needs to do it in quite a short turnover. So it brings me to sort of thinking, why haven't Silver Lake bought any stock? Now, I'm not totally sure what you guys think of this. We haven't spoken about it too much, but just a bit of background. St. Barbara have about 800 million shares on issue. The average daily volume over the past 3 months is 7 million shares. Now, Silver Lake have highlighted that they have almost $270 million in cash, and just buying up a bit of stock, even if it's just under that 5%, 4.99%, that would help in stopping the vote going ahead, because something we need to mention, and I'm sure we're going to dig into, the St. Barbara deal with Genesis needs shareholder approval. So they need at least 50% of shareholders of each company to vote this one forward.
So I think that some considerations of them buying stock, and don't get me wrong, I'm sure it's something that Silver Lake have thought of, and they might actually already own some. We don't know, right? But the reality is that it absolutely helps them for the purposes of voting down a Genesis transaction. They're kind of stuck with that stock after that vote, though, and there's no guarantee that their transaction gets over the line themselves. So I think there's a couple of considerations there. Do they actually have any interest in the non-Leonora assets? Probably not. And yet owning the stock probably lends itself more towards a corporate type of merger from a rationale perspective, and that might just be a path that's a bit unpalatable given the other assets at play here. So,
well, my first thought when I saw that, when we did discuss why aren't they buying shares, I couldn't see Silver Lake wanting to buy St. Barbara shares and having any exposure to the Atlantic and Simberi assets. What do you think? Is that your thought too?
I actually think that it might be an option. You can sell St. Barbara's shares at the end of it. Depending on the size, though, it'd be pretty hard to find a buyer. So I think, look, it genuinely is an option. They wouldn't have any, I doubt they've got any interest in the non-Leonora assets, but just in terms of creating some influence, it could be a real consideration. Like another thing to think about there, though, is how can they vote that stock how can they vote that share on? There's two separate things that they'd want to be able to vote it on, right? The first is being able to block the Genesis transaction, which they can use to block the Genesis transaction. But then there's going to be another shareholder vote required, and if they bought more than 10%, then when it comes to actually trying to approve their proposal, then they would need another listing rule approval. So that's listing rule 10.1. And they'd basically they would be able to use their 10% stake in order to vote on that, and that's sort of a related party listing rule that would have to be approved by shareholders where they can't vote in it themselves.
So would the only reason they'd buy stock would be to give them the voting power to turn down
the Genesis one, because that one is going to a vote as things stand.
Totally, yeah.
So I think the next step from there is to sort of look into the next shareholders. So look down the register, and we should sort of preface this, what we're going to talk about now, with the fact that we've pulled up data on the top 20 shareholders. These things are sort of notoriously wrong. The data is updated at various points in time.
It's usually updated from the annual report, is that right? It doesn't get updated. It gets updated once a year, does it?
When there's changes in significant holdings, you'll see that, and there's various other announcements that'll pop up and show it. So it's not just the annual report.
Yeah, there's a bunch of data providers that can sort of source flows that yield varying degrees of accuracy.
Yeah,
whenever you talk about publicly sourced shareholdings, you got to sort of caveat the quality of the data. The only way you can get really good data on this is via the company's share registry themselves that they provide you. But I don't think they're going to be in a rush to give us their share
St.
registry.
Barbara, if you feel like sending us your top 20 shareholder list, that'd be much appreciated for our analysis.
Yeah, we'll have a few other questions if they start replying as well, I'm sure.
but hey, we should point out, the invite is open. We'd love to have anyone from St. Barbara, anyone from Silver Lake, anyone from Genesis on the show.
Or all three at once would be sensational, I think.
A fireside chat.
What do you think of panel?
A panel. Oh, that would be some juicy content. I think I would be watching that one with keen eyes. I don't think we'd even have to facilitate that. I just think they could talk and we just press record.
Yeah, we'll be back in 2 hours.
So digging into that top 20 that we just referenced. So from our numbers, 63% of the shares on issue are held by the top 20. And as you'd expect, there's many passive funds in there too. So when you think of big passive funds, you think of the likes of Vanguard and BlackRock and so on. Now, the question that springs to my mind immediately is, how are these guys going to vote? They are often just holding shares as a part of a big index. So as a generic example, your ASX 200 index, and all these funds will just have to hold all the shares of companies in the ASX 200.
Well, I mean, totally. And stepping it back a second, this whole letter from Silver Lake it's a letter targeting St. Barbara's shareholders. So Silver Lake obviously are of the belief that there is a pathway to an outcome here if they can really cut through to St. Barbara's shareholders. And so, I think that they clearly believe there's a way through. What do you think, JD?
Well, wouldn't those funds vote based on what is recommended by the board?
Not always. So
Always?
They can, and there's often these ISS, I forget what the acronym stands for, but they sort of advise on how these bigger groups will vote. But yeah, it sort of depends on the issue, where and what's going on exactly. But there was a statement I saw on the Van Eck website. Now, Van Eck are the group that create the sort of GDX and GDXJ, which are the big gold exchanges, and they hold almost 10% of St. Barbara. And interestingly, they don't hold any Genesis, but they also do hold a bit of stock in Silver Lake. Now, the line that stood out to me from their website was, ultimately, investment managers have a fiduciary duty to act in the best interest of investors, facilitated by taking an active position regarding proxy votes. Now, to me, that's really interesting. That sounds like they will look at what is in the best interest of the shareholders, and that could lead them to voting against this Genesis St. Barbara transaction. Totally. Because they might be of the stance that the Silver Lake might provide better returns to the shareholders.
So just to paint the picture even more, JD, I mean, you've got support, like Silver Lake's got support indicatively for they call it 18% of the register via L1 and Baker Steel, and they need to get to that sort of 50% level or approximating it, getting near that 50% level where it's sort of enough pressure that St. Barbara feel like there's a real doubt in actually getting an approval here. And so we've got 18% there already. What's the pathway to the next 32? You're saying that VanEck is one lever. What does the rest of the register look like?
Yeah, so we've got First Sentier 7%. Now, should flag that they also own Genesis and Silver Lake stock. Schroeder, roughly 4%. DZ Bank, which is a private bank from Europe, so that would likely be a high net worth individual, I'd imagine, similar to a nominee type account you might see in Australia. Aussie Super, 3.5%, but sort of needless to say, they're a big backer of Genesis and Raleigh. And Norges, which is the sovereign wealth fund of Norway, and Franklin Templeton, they together make up roughly 3%, but also worth mentioning that they hold stock in Genesis. So
that's pretty interesting, right? Because you look at a lot of these players who have a degree of influence on getting to that 50%. There's quite a few names on there that hold stock in Genesis, and they would rightfully be fearful that if this proposed deal with St. Barbara gets voted down, that the value of their Genesis holding would fall by a lot more than any change in their St. Barbara holding by virtue of doing a deal with Silver Lake.
Exactly. I think there's a bit of an onus on Silver Lake to articulate to the shareholders how they're going to provide value beyond the transaction to really win them over.
Totally. So Silver Lake's they've got to make a pitch to these funds and say, hang on, the value that your Genesis shares are going to go down by is going to be completely offset because we're going to create so much value, and look, there's a premium there already. So yeah, I think it's a harder sell to those institutions that are clearly bullish Genesis as well, especially Aussie Super, right? You just saw Aussie Super stand to just. It's a pretty big statement. Their support in the two conditional placements that have been conducted, and so I'd be surprised if they voted their position in St. Barbara.
Do you think there will be a psychological play for these big institutions that are top shareholders in St. Barbara who have lost a lot of money, but see this as a potential to recoup a portion of it, or not? Do you think that'd play? Or they'd more be looking from what's lost is lost, and are we going to make more out of Genesis or St. Barbara?
Yeah, I think I reckon that mentality is maybe a bit more true with the retail punter. Instos sort of don't get too trapped into the sunk loss fallacy. They hopefully stay a bit more rational along the way and just evaluate everything on the merits. In the past is the past.
And we also don't know how long these guys have all been shareholders for. So I think we should just
just on that point too, JD. I mean, a decent part of Barb's register would actually be, Bardock shareholders, for example. They did that deal not long ago, and I mean, so I think you've just got a bunch of maybe not necessarily natural shareholders of the stock, and how do you anticipate how they're feeling about this?
Yeah. So worth diving a bit deeper on L1 and Baker Steel. So like we said before, they have roughly 18%. Now Silver Lake have flagged that they're on Silver Lake's side of this transaction. Well, they want to see the St. Barbara board explore the transaction with Silver Lake a bit more. And so L1 they're an activist fund. Now what that sort of means is they've got a track record of going into companies, buying up shares, and potentially asking for a board seat or pushing the management for changes that they want to see. That's really the role of what an activist does. Baker Steel, a bit harder to find any colour on how active they might get. But just another angle which I thought we'd brainstorm over is whether they'd want a board seat. Now, your St. Barbara board isn't your typical board. It's four seats on that board. So how likely this all is kind of unknown. But
4 seats on the board, a new chairperson, because the chairperson just stood down.
Who had been on the board for a while.
Had some history of being on the board. Dan Locker, how long has he been at the company? It's not that long, right?
Since late 2022. Came from once that Western Areas transaction was all done and done.
Yeah. So, I mean, yeah.
It's an interesting one. So traditionally 5 to 10% of a holding in a company would kind of get you a right to a board seat. That's not in any sort of statements written down, but I don't think that really applies here. Although combined holding 18%, it's worth a shout. Could we see something like what we saw at Breaker for the former chairman pushing to get rid of the entire board? I think it's it's
the Colonel trying to kick off the board.
Yeah, it's a tough call, but we'll sort of keep an eye on that one and see if there's any sort of action at a board level.
Well, I think Silver Lake alluded to this sort of potential in the wording of their letter today. It does say voting down or other alternatives that shareholders could have rights to doing, and they're potentially talking about something like this.
So why are we thinking that they're going after these assets still? And mostly, is this just going to continue on their website? Is this information actually going to get to the ASX at some point?
Mate,
do you think?
I don't know what Silver Lake are bloody paying ASX in listing fees per year, but to date we're an independent source of information. We call it as we see, but they should start paying bloody money of mine. We're getting it to more people than ASX at the moment. So
yeah, I know. Well, okay, let's look at why they're going after these Leonora assets out of we've talked about Musgrave as potential opportunity, but look, we can probably surmise that they are looking for quick ounces to keep everything flowing.
I think you're bang on with that, Matty, and that's something that we didn't actually mention on Friday. But just having a quick look at Mount Monger and Deflector, both have less than 600,000 ounces in reserve. If you have a quick look at the various projects across the Leonora assets, and they've got 3 million ounces. So
is that in reserve or resource?
That's in reserve.
Reserve. Yeah.
So
did that include Aphrodite and Zoroastrian?
That's right. Tower Hill, Gwalia, and the assets they'd scooped up from the acquisition of Bardock.
So you could nearly probably write off Aphrodite, you would imagine. That's the refractory run. Zoroastrian, I did find a cross-section on that. That's a pretty shallow dipping ore body in bits based on the one cross-section I've seen. So whether they see an opportunity for that project, I'm not sure.
It's really Gwalia, Tower Hill in a few years' time, you'd think, and any potential sort of bolt-ons. But that's, one point which I think we didn't stress enough on Friday, that their reserves are getting shorter and they need to sort of feel that out.
I want to go over a couple of things that really stood out in the Silver Lake announcement to me as a bit of I read firstly as right, I reckon Silver Lake's having a bit of a dig here at Genesis. Look, and some of it wasn't, you couldn't say factual, but it was like their version of the facts. So they were really honing in on the Silver Lake's management team. So they said, look, Silver Lake's current portfolio of underground mines, management team's demonstrated experience and track record of mining underground mines in Western Australia. I first thought, right, they're honing in on the fact that Genesis have come from an open pit background. The Saracen did have Thunderbox, Carasoo Dam underground projects, but RAL is come from an open pit background. So that was the first thing I sort of read from that. And the other one was when they were talking about what St Barbara will end up with post-transaction. So they said, look, they'll get 26% of Silver Lake on an undiluted basis and a 25.7% of Silver Lake on a fully diluted basis, saying approximately a 1% difference between. Then they said under the Genesis transaction, St Barbara will own 15.2% of Genesis undiluted and 14.5% of Genesis fully diluted, and then in brackets a 5% difference. So it was putting those differences in there between the diluted thing, was highlighting how many options that Genesis have on board, which you boys would know. I assume they're going to RAL, those options.
There was a large option package that was, I think Riley got a good portion, and as well all the shareholders that came in that sort of transformative transaction they did a couple of years ago now.
Yeah, so they stood out to me. I found them very interesting.
Totally.
Yeah, there was one more question that sort of sprung to mind. What constitutes a fiduciary out? So we can see from the numbers we did that the Silver Lake deal was almost 15% in premium to the Genesis deal. So we've done a bit of digging on this one.
Well, you have, mate, and we should absolutely disclose that we have to lend on a bit of legal expertise here, which is currently not baked into our skill set. But I've put some questions out into some people who can answer this question, and the response I got back, I'll read it out, but I won't attribute it. Is that courts and the takeovers panel are always reluctant to challenge a board's decision making regarding their fiduciary responsibilities. In order to get the panel interested, you need to point to a corporate control issue, which is not present because this is an asset deal. Silver Lake, they could try to argue their disclosure is deficient and complain to ASIC, but ASIC would be too slow. And the last paragraph is actually a bit of advice. The trick would be for Silver Lake to improve their offer and then force St. Barbara to reconsider and publicly retest their fiduciary responsibilities. So perhaps that's the bigger play here all along, is going public now and benchmarking it and then coming back with a higher offer, in which case the board's under pressure immediately to retest that fiduciary responsibilities again.
So you're saying that Silver Lake would have to put in another offer higher than their 750?
Correct.
That would lead to the St. Barbara board having to reconsider it.
Exactly.
Would they have to only could they increase it by $2 million and make them reconsider it? How does that work?
I think the exercise that the board of St. Barbara would have done is that, it would have required a degree of internal valuation work, and that, valuation paper goes to the board so that they can have something to stand behind in why they haven't, opened the door. And so there'd be a number in their head of what needs to be met. Silver Lake will be trying to guess that number without going too high.
If you look on that chart that Silver Lake highlighted, looking back over the past 12 months, the deal as it stands now would have averaged a 35% premium. That's in line with your traditional sort of buyout premium, So
this is an asset deal, right? So you shouldn't be, benchmarking it as a premium to Genesis's existing deal. I mean, yeah, it is really interesting. I mean, what are your takeaways? Like looking at this whole 6-page document, like JD, like if you just zoom out a bit, like where do you land interpreting all of this?
And just highlight that this isn't on the ASX. That's the biggest bloody takeaway. Like it's 2 announcements now that haven't even been on the ASX.
We obviously
have you
put out a
seen
piece.
this before?
I haven't personally, but I'm sure something like this has happened before. But we put out our bid on Friday, and we made a point to please have someone explain to us why this hasn't been allowed on ASX, and all the feedback that came in over the weekend, not a single person could articulate to us why this hasn't been allowed on ASX. So I think that's still a bloody please explain. Like,
granted, we don't have too many friends at the ASX, but it would be interesting to hear what they have to say.
Even an someone that's used to work there who might have a view, like anyone that's just got some familiarity with ASX listing rules and disclosure requirements. Can someone please tell us what's going on here?
Was this one actually rejected again, or did they just go straight to the website?
Or does it go under the same premise that the first one was rejected, so this one would be rejected too?
Yeah,
I assume it was probably rejected as well, to be honest. I mean,
it
didn't come out before market. This is sort of a few hours into market, which to me is a bit indicative of maybe they'd submitted a bit earlier and it got knocked back. But heck, I think that the theatrics now are almost just have people clicking the refresh on their media release page and seeing what comes next. So. I actually don't think it matters too much that it's not coming out on ASX now, because everyone's a bit hooked to what is Silver Lake going to release on their website next. I'm sure they've never had more internet traffic in their life.
Oh, I think so. But you would assume St. Barbara and Genesis have been hoping it's going away, but though we're not doing a good job of letting that happen with a bit of media coverage around it, are we?
That's right.
So where to from here then? If you look at the last page of their announcement, they've pretty much given the scenarios Silver Lake have put out, saying that, as we mentioned before, Genesis have the right to match the bidding offer. What's that? That's the I was under the no shop, no talk.
That's right. I think if you want a hot take, I would say that the pressure on the St. Barbara board will mount over the coming weeks, and it'd be really interesting to see what St. Barbara's current shareholders say, but I'm sure we'll see St. Barbara's board come out with another announcement over the next couple of weeks, and I wouldn't be too surprised if they have to reconsider that one way or another, whether that comes from another Silver Lake bid.
Yeah, I think that's going to depend a lot on shareholder pressure.
Yeah,
And then, so the two scenarios here that Silver Lake put out, if Genesis decided to match any such binding offer, say Barbara shareholders would have the benefit of an improved Genesis transaction, or if they did not decide to match it, then they'd have the benefit, St. Barbara shareholders would have the benefit of the Silver Lake proposal. So it's upside for both. That's how they're painting the situation. Right, stay tuned everyone. We will be back on this.